Lake George Battlefield Moments, a production of the Lake George Battlefield Park Alliance, preserving our area's incredible history. A weekly feature on 93.5 FM and live streaming at lakefm.com. Here's the president of the Lake George Battlefield Park Alliance, John Denuzzo.
Hi, this is John Denuzzo, Lake George Battlefield Park Alliance. Welcome to Lake George Battlefield Moments. Our guest is John Eric Nelson, a familiar face in the region, is a longtime historian of the French and Indian War and a reenactor of events that commemorated that crucial conflict. John Eric lives in Milford, Connecticut, is a summer resident in the Ticonderoga area. Welcome, John Eric.
Oh, thank you, John. Glad to be with you.
Well, thank you. And, we're talking today about the Battle on Snowshoes that occurred March the 13th, 1758. But a year earlier, there was another Battle on Snowshoes. Tell us about that one and what the outcomes of that were.
Well, in January of 1757, Rogers led a scout party from Fort Edward, picking up some more troops at Fort William Henry. They went up to the area of Crown Point. The battle should really be called the Battle of Barbeau Creek, which today we call Putnam's Creek and is located in Crown Point, New York. The battle actually took place up on the site of Sugar Hill, which is in the center of Crown Point, New York, up on a hill to the side, more to the west. So that's where the battle took place. What happened was, this was one of the first times that Rogers had run into problems. What they did, in 4 days, they marched from Fort Edward, picking up more troops in Fort William Henry, and then they go up Lake George, or down Lake George, technically, and they get down around Hague, New York today, near Friends Point. And from there, they cut overland, keeping Rogers Rock, as we call it today, but French called it Mount Pelée, to their right to avoid the French patrols that were going in that Trout Brook Valley area and along Lake George. So after 4 days, they reached the area in what today would be Crown Point, New York. Their mission was to get information about the French. As soon as they arrive up in that area on Lake Champlain, they spy a French supply sled coming from Ticonderoga, or Carillon as the French called it, heading up toward Fort Crown Point. Rogers sends John Starks with 20 men to the north to cut off the sleigh. Just as they go to attack that sleigh, Rogers sees about a dozen more French sleighs coming from Fort Carillon. He does not have time to warn Starks. Starks springs the ambush on the single sleigh. Rogers tries to attack the dozen sleighs that are now in the rear. And what happens is many of the French are able to escape back to Carillon and some up to Crown Point, where there were large winter garrisons at both places. Rogers captures some men, realizes he is in big trouble, so he breaks one of his own rules, which was never go back the way you came. But he decides that because the snow is so deep, his men have already broken trail in the snow, they go back exactly the way they came in. And somewhere after crossing Putnam's Creek, as we call it today, Creek La Beau, they get to Sugar Hill. The French had already started tracking him from Carillon and had set up an ambush up on the hill. They spring the ambush. Rogers walks into it. He goes up on top of Sugar Hill. They hold off until dark, taking some casualties. And then, as one of his rules were, hold on till dark and then disperse and go back to the rendezvous point, which was back at Friends Point in Hague, New York. So when it was all said and done, the French suffered about maybe 28 killed, 30 wounded. The Rangers lost 13 killed and 14 wounded. And they had dispatched all the French prisoners that they had captured from the sled. And after several days, he's able to get back down to Fort William Henry, and that ends the Battle of what we should be really called La Beau Creek.
Okay, thank you. So we fast forward a year, the battle on Snowshoes, the more familiar of the two skirmishes that have that name. What was the context of that battle?
Well, during the winter in the 18th century, the armies would go back into their main communities. So the French would go to Montreal and Quebec. The British would go to Albany, Boston, New York, etc. for the winter, leaving small garrisons. But during the winter, the British would have raiding parties and scouting parties to capture prisoners, get intelligence, and just basically harass the French. Now, the French had been doing this for 100 years, and they were very good at it. And examples would have been the 1704 raid in Deerfield, the raid on Fort William Henry earlier in the year when the French came down. So this battle on Snowshoes was an example of the British trying to intimidate, but also mimic what the French were very good at. So the force that Rogers was supposed to have was 400 men. Colonel Haviland, the British commander, cuts him in half down to 183 men. Israel Putnam had just returned from the Carillon area. That's a Connecticut ranger. And he had lost some men. They had disappeared. So what they had done is been captured by the French. And so the French knew that Rogers was coming. And also French spies. For 2 weeks, everybody knew that Rogers was going up on this raid. So on a 3-day march with sleds, they go up Lake George. And again, in the Friends Point area, which is just south of Rogers Rock State Park today, they camp overnight on the 12th. They decide the next morning that they're going to leave all their supplies there, then move up along the Trout Brook, which was the French patrol route. And when they got up near what is today the Ticonderoga Golf Course, their scouts informed them that there's about 100 French and Indians coming down the Trout Brook from Fort Carillon. Rogers quickly sets up an ambush. The ambush is successful, but the British and the Rangers just lose their minds, rush down to scalp and steal the booty from the French down in the valley on the brook. Unbeknownst to them, a force of over 400 French are coming down the brook. They had only just attacked the lead element of that French. So they have their weapons unloaded. They didn't bother reloading them, and the French hit them. They push them back toward the golf course and up on the side of the hill, which is today Route 9. The Rangers get cut into two elements, and they're losing men like crazy because they had already marched during the day. The battle had started at 3 when they ambushed the French, and now it's starting to get nightfall. So Rogers again does what his rules say, hang on to darkness, and then we'll leave. But one of his officers and many of his men are trapped away from the main body. And the French and Indians surround them and capture them, and they surrender. As nightfall comes, Rogers and the men disperse and go in several different areas. Now, those captured men were in Captain Phillips's group, were cut off, and after surrendering, the French gave them no quarter and killed all of them. Rogers and his men go back. Some go back down the Trout Brook and back toward Friends Point the way they came in. Rogers and some of the men go over the gap between Cook Mountain and what we call today Rogers Rock, which was called Mount Pelée at that time. At the top of the mountain, Rogers leaves his coat, and then the controversy begins. Where did he go? The French do not follow because it's dark. They're back scalping, collecting the booty from the fallen Rangers. They didn't want to go into the dark to take on the devil. So the next morning when the French go up, they see the footprints. They find his coat with his warrant in it. They think he's come down the face of Rogers Rock, the slide that goes down to Lake George. But most of the historians disprove that. He either backtracked on his snowshoes, then came over the gap, ended up down in what today is Hart's Bay, and then came along the lake to Friends Point. Or there is a gully to the west on Rogers Rock that he also may have gone down. So there's a controversy there. No way he came down the slot.
Yeah. As I understand it, also, Rogers, for all his self-promoting, never addressed how he actually had gotten out, adding more to the mystery, correct?
Absolutely. Plus, he was embarrassed. He got his butt kicked. So, anyway, they get back to Friends Point where they had stashed their sleds and their wagons. He sends a guy back down to Fort Edward to get sleighs to come up and take care of his wounded. They start moving back down, and finally they get down there. The final count at the end of the day was the Rangers lost 102 out of the 183 men engaged. The French numbers are really out of whack. They claim that they only lost 27 men dead or wounded, but the number might have ranged up to 100 also because of that initial ambush. So that is the second battle on snowshoes, which should be the really one. And by the afternoon of March 15th, Rogers and the surviving Rangers reached Fort Edward. Remember, Fort William Henry is not there anymore because it was burned down by the French that earlier summer.
So preceding that, obviously, as you said, was the siege of Fort William Henry the prior summer. Now, later in 1758, the British, under Abercrombie, attacked the French at Carillon and, woefully were beaten back severely by the French. How did the battle on snowshoes influence their plans, or did it influence their plans, both the British and the French, when it came that the British decided to attack in July of that year?
Well, one of the things that I really believe in, it did a couple of things. First, by Rogers getting beat, it kind of took the mythology that he was this ghost, this unbeatable person, off the table. So the French originally thought he had been killed because they found his warrant in his jacket on top of Rogers Rock. But later, several months later, they realized that he had not been killed. But he lost so many men of that patrol, and it was unsuccessful. So that myth was broken. So that's one thing. The other, he lost over 100 Rangers. These were his trained men with wood skills. They had to be replaced by June of 1758. So in June of 1758, General Abercrombie orders that the provincial companies from the different colonies are to contribute 30 men to the ranging corps under Rogers to supplement and make up for that loss. So now you've got provincials with little to no ranging skills that are now operating as rangers. One of the big problems that Abercrombie has is lack of intelligence about what the French strength is, where they are, how many men are at Carillon, how many are at Crown Point, where are the reinforcements. There's rumors from French deserters that take this thing all over the place. They only had 3,500 men at Fort Carillon. That's what the French had. A few hundred more up at Crown Point. But there were rumors that thousands of French were coming down from Montreal. So there was no scouting going on during that summer. So, in fact, Abercrombie was going in blind.
Well, thank you, John Eric Nelson, for being our guest. I want to also announce that John Eric will be giving a public presentation about the battle on snowshoes in June, date undetermined at this point, but at Lake George. Details to follow, and that'll be part of a special North Lake George boat tour we'll be doing for Lake George Battlefield Park Alliance members. So, John Eric, we thank you.
Well, thank you for having me.
Appreciate it. Again, our website is lakegeorgebattlefield.org.
Lake George Battlefield Moments, a production of the Lake George Battlefield Park Alliance, preserving our area's incredible history. For more on this topic, check out the Lake George Battlefield Park Alliance podcast, a weekly feature on Lake FM 93.5 FM and live streaming at lakefm.com. For more information, go to lakegeorgebattlefield.org and tune in every Saturday morning for Lake George Battlefield Moments.